Good afternoon, everybody. Please go ahead and finish eating and enjoying your meal and your dessert. I'm going to interrupt, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our afternoon program. My name is Dale Fowler. I work at the Texas Education Agency. It's my pleasure to introduce our luncheon speaker, Dr. Kazique Prince. Dr. Prince has been someone that I've worked with on some projects around the Austin area. Been a pleasure to do that. You're in for a real treat today to hear him. Let me give you a little bit about his background and information before he begins. Dr. Kazique Prince is founder and chief executive officer at Jelani Consulting, based here in Austin. His company provides executive and leadership consultation and coaching services focused on cultural competency. Dr. Prince also serves as a senior policy advisor and education coordinator for the City of Austin's Mayor, Steve Adler. In the Mayor's office, education and public policy under his portfolio, as well as efforts to create equitable economic development and to promote equity and inclusion to meet strategic goals within the Mayor's agenda. Recently, Dr. Prince launched Courage Equity, a nonprofit organization created to provide funding for education on diversity and inclusion and promote cultural relevant practice. He also writes and produces Equity Turned Up, a blog and podcast reflecting on a variety of equity and inclusion topics in business, education, and education, nonprofit, and social issues. Throughout his career, Dr. Prince carved out a reputation as a dynamic and comprehensive communicator and trusted advisor. He's governed by a focused vision for the future and fueled by a passion to make a difference in the new global economy. In 2015, Kazique won the Texas Diversity First Award and was recognized for the I Am Black Austin campaign by the Greater Austin Black Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Prince served on the Executive Task Force Committee for the Austin Area My Brother's Keeper, White House Initiative, Advisory Council Chair to the Austin African American Cultural Heritage District, Education Committee Co-Chair for the Greater Austin Black Chamber of Commerce, and member of the Texas Diversity Council's Central Texas Advisory Council. He's also a member of the NAACP and the Austin Area Urban League. He received his PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Georgia at Athens, his EDS in counseling specialties in counseling psychology, at Georgia State University, his master's in education in counseling psychology at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and his BS in psychology from the Benjamin Banneker Honors College at Prairie View A&M University. He's also a board-certified diplomat in African-centered black psychology. He's a father of two burgeoning teenagers. We'll have to figure out what burgeoning means exactly. Have an idea. He volunteers with his children's parent-teacher association as the membership and outreach chair and supports various other activities in the Austin area. A fabulous person, very interesting speaker. You'll like him a lot. Welcome, Dr. Kazique Prince.
I hope you're like me. I don't really like hearing about myself, and appreciate Dale editing some of the other wonderful things out. But I'm here today to talk with you guys about equity. You'll hear me use several words almost interchangeably, but we'll spend some time trying to tease those things out. I'll use words like multiculturalism. You probably won't hear me say affirmative action because that's like a bad word. But I'll talk about equity, I'll talk about diversity, I'll talk a number of things. At any point during our conversation today, feel free to stop and ask questions. That's kind of my MO. But I want to first, before we get started, unfortunately, we're having this conversation about equity during a very difficult time here in our country. We had a death of 50 people in Orlando due to a shooter who killed those individuals on Sunday. Regardless of your background or where you come from, when you hear the death of that many people in such a short amount of time, I think it's important to take some time to just recognize and think about the families who are impacted by this, the communities. I think it was the largest death of shooters in our country's history. And so if we could just take a moment, and I know you're eating, but if we could just stand one moment, just have a moment of silence, please. I would just ask you if whether you come from a certain faith tradition or not, that we just take this time to remember the folks who are lost, the 53 people who were hurt, and all the families and communities who were impacted negatively by this event yesterday. We just have a moment of silence. Thank you. And I hate to start these kind of conversations on a somber note, because if you've been to any diversity trainings or inclusion trainings in the past, hopefully them very positive. Unfortunately, sometimes they can be negative. And so I try to make these as fun and engaging as possible. But I also want to set some kind of ground rules of sorts. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the ground rules, but one of the things that I like using this little poster here. It says, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. When you're dealing with diversity and inclusion, change does not happen unless you get outside of your comfort zone. But the challenge is, what is your comfort zone? Well, your comfort zone tends to be that place where you feel really comfortable, in front of the TV, watching Netflix, watching one of those wonderful shows that you kind of, I don't know about you, but what's my last show I watched? I think it was Daredevil. I watched the entire series in one weekend. That's my comfort zone, right? For some of y'all, it's Downton Abbey. Brothers, whatever the show, your favorite show, you sit down, that's your comfort zone. You don't want anyone messing with you. Matter of fact, I tell my kids, don't even come talk to me because I'm watching Daredevil. This is my time. Leave me alone. Father's Day is coming up on Sunday. That is not a day to come ask me to go take you somewhere. That's my day. So that's my comfort zone, right? But the truth is, in our comfort zone, we tend not to learn a whole lot. We try to just kind of keep things steady, have a nice little sense of equilibrium. What I do want to avoid is the terror zone. Because that's what people think of. They think, you want me to do something different. They go straight to the terror zone. You start talking about racism and sexism. They go, oh, snap. I don't want to take you to the terror zone today. We're going to be hopefully a little bit in a comfort zone, but I also want you to go into your courage zone. You really challenge yourself in an area that you feel comfortable with about some of the things that we're talking about today. And so I'm going to ask you to be in that courage zone. If you need to go back to your comfort zone, that's fine with me. Don't tell anyone else. Just, pretend like you're in your courage zone. But definitely if you're in your terror zone, I hope that's not an experience we're going to have today. But if for some reason you need to step up and go out and take a walk, feel free to do that. My point here is I want you to hopefully grow from the information you're being provided today, hopefully have some good conversation here. I do know that, I forget the gentleman who spoke with me, but I am going to make the slides available to you. So if you're the kind of person who likes to take a lot of notes, don't feel like you have to, because all this information will be provided to you. All right? Just so you know, I am African American. I come from a black church, and so when I say I'm kind of looking for that back. If you want to say amen, that's all. I'm good with that too. So we're going to move forward. All right. All right. We're going to get some ground rules here. At your table, part of the thing is, I want to know who's at the table, and so I want to just we're not going to go into deep into this, but what I want you to do, maybe you're going to dyads or triads, just briefly talk about these two questions. And the first question says, what is your background around cultural differences? And the second question is, what is more challenging for you in working with people from other cultures? And just I'm going to give you like 2 or 3 minutes on this. Is it okay? You're not going to dig deep, but you're going to kind of get this ball rolling. All right? And since we don't have a lot of time, at least get through the first question. All right? All right. Go. If I could bring your attention back to the front. I know we have some really great conversations gotten started on these very seemingly simple questions about what your cultural background will be. We are not going to have time for us to kind of go through everyone, of course, to kind of talk about this. These are questions that I ask when I do my work in the community. One of the things that was mentioned earlier is I do work for the mayor's office, but I work there part-time. My other job is working with organizations, whether it be businesses, schools, municipalities, helping them through their diversity and inclusion work. Because as you probably know, a lot of organizations do not have someone who's dedicated solely to that effort. And my job is to come in and help them move forward. And one of the questions I ask when I do some work with folks is these basic questions. If you're a person, and you don't have to raise hands because I'm not trying to point anyone out, if you looked at the first question and you didn't know what the answer was, that's okay. What I have a tendency for is many white Americans don't know how to respond to the first question because they're not quite sure. So, okay, if I am white, what does that mean? And that's okay for a lot of white Americans. They don't know what that means. That's kind of par for the course. Oftentimes, this question is not about what race you come back, but how do you identify? Do you identify as a Texan? Do you identify as maybe here in Austin, you're an Austinite? Maybe you identify as a Southerner. Maybe you identify as a football player. The point is, what are the identities, what are the hats that you wear that make up who you are as a person? And so this doesn't have to be just about race. This may be, I'm a feminist. I'm a conservative. Whatever it may be, what are the things that you identify with the most? This is what the first question is really dealing about. And the reason I'm asking you this because part of this is one of the things that's really a challenge in this work is that it's really easy to start talking about how I'm going to work with students, how I'm going to work with family members, kind of the work on other people. And the truth is, most of the work you'll be doing with the diversity and inclusion is really on yourself as a priority. So if you make an error in doing anything, it's first working on yourself and becoming more aware of where you are, where you stand, and how you interact with other people. Does that make sense? Amen? No? All right, cool. Remember to do the amen thing. It helps me out. So this is just kind of a starter. And so when I ask that question, and this is something I've come up with over the number of years, I tell people that I have these three faces. I definitely identify as African American. And if you know these three individuals, they're not people who always agree with one another. But depending on the circumstance and the situation, any one of those faces can come up. The one that is my favorite is Jack Johnson. He's the first individual to the left. He's the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world. He was a champion back in the early 1900s. There's actually a documentary about him, so if you're interested in learning more about him, I would encourage you. What was fascinating about him was here's an African-American man during the time when everyone else there was lynchings and all kinds of horrible things happening to African-Americans. Most of the people that he dated were white women. When he got into the boxing ring, he would laugh at the crowd and taunt them. Things that any other African-American would do, they would be dead the next day, if not the same day. This man would go into the gym and just taunt people and be in their face. He was many things that Muhammad Ali was well before Muhammad Ali was even existent. But a lot of people don't know about him. But I like him because he's the face that comes out when I get pretty upset about something. I'm from 5th Ward, Houston, which is pretty much the hood, and we call it the Dirty Fifth because it's pretty rough. So when I go to the Bronx and I'm having to deal with someone, Jack Johnson just comes out because that's the part of me that's, protect myself, protect my family. But another face is the Booker T. Washington face. That face is the face of someone who's maybe a little more compromised and maybe feels like I have to kind of quiet down to kind of get along. Let me just learn my part, do what I need to do, and get by, but just getting by. I may not like that face many times, but it's a role because sometimes I can't just speak out whenever I want to, say whatever I want to. But that's the face that I have. And the last one is W. Du Bois, who's another one of my favorites because he's the intellectual. He's the one that says, I have a right, I should be at the table, you will listen to what I have to say. It's the intellectual, it's the talented tenth that says, hey, we have something to contribute to this country. We've been contributing to this country for a very long time. And so depending on where you catch me on any given day, you'll see one or all three of those faces at any given time. So when I answer the question around what's my cultural background, this is how I answer it. Now, I'm not asking you to go find 3 white people or 3 Asians or 3 Latinos that reflect that. I'm saying this is how I identify this. You'll learn about me as you learn about these individuals. And I would encourage you to do the same kind of thing of who are the kind of people who you honor, who you respect, people you find that are important in your lives. Does that make sense? All right, excellent. And so the question you might be asking yourself, well, why are we talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, as we did earlier, we had a moment of silence because we had a death of 50 people in Orlando. We had the South Carolina church shootings not too long ago. That was just last year. We have up in Waco, we had the sexual assault of several women that was being hidden by some of the administration. You had more than 2 people lose their jobs behind that whole situation, that whole scandal. You had the gorilla shooting, and you're asking yourself, how is that a diversity issue? Because no one knew it until later on. They noticed that the child who was being dragged by the gorilla was African American. There was a question about whether the gorilla's life was more important than the African-American boy's life. And then there was a question about the parents and their parenting skills. And what became an issue is they went to the father's background and found out that he had been arrested. And so there was a question about his value as a parent, which had nothing to do with a gorilla. Anyone who's ever had a kid, how many times your kid gets away from you? I was talking to my ex-wife. I said, remember that time when our son went to the third floor where no one was, didn't come in and say, hey, Poppy, I'm going to the third floor. He just went up there all by himself. Now, we're scared. They locked down the building. You feel like a terrible parent at that moment because you don't know where your kid is. People are looking at you crazy. But the truth is, if you're a parent, you experience that kind of thing on a regular basis. Who has left their kid in the car for at least half a second, half a minute? Unintentionally. You went all the way into the restaurant, and you're like, wait a minute, where's Bobby? Oh, snap, go get Bobby. These are common things as parents that we don't like admitting, but they're things that happen. But unfortunately, terrible things happen as a result. And so then we have the presidential campaign. I'm not taking any political positions here, but a lot of the subject matter that surround our two nominees that we have focus on issues around diversity and inclusion. You can't avoid the conversation because if you turn on the TV, it comes up almost every day. We have the Black Lives Matter initiative that's been going on across this country. We have our first African-American president, and we have our first female presidential nominee. Never has happened in our history as a country. These issues of diversity and inclusion come up every day. They come up in the classroom. Young people and families are bringing these subject matters. So you, as folks who work with these communities, have to be prepared for those conversations. If you're not willing to have these conversations or even adjust your curriculum in such a way that you're responding to those questions, you're not dealing with reality. So there's the big issues, right? And then there's the more everyday kinds of things. The truth of the matter is change is here. Just even in Austin, we're going from a community that was predominantly white to becoming a minority-majority city. And Austin is one of the fastest growing cities in the state and in the country. We have 150 people who move to Austin every day. Every day. 40 people leave Austin every day because they can't afford to live here because the cost of living is so high. And most of those people tend to be working class, oftentimes Latino and African American families. That change is happening every day. We have to be prepared for it. Disparities continue. When you look at the numbers, I know you guys know them. You look at how certain groups, particularly folks who are more affluent, tend to be white. They tend to score better on different tests. They have better reading levels. These are things I know you're well aware of. These are always going on. National interest invest in the future. So when we look at the population in the next several decades, 1 in 2 workers will be persons of color. So you look at where you work, wherever, small town or large city, chances are the staff that you work with, the people that you serve, are going to be more and more people of color from different backgrounds. Definitely fosters innovation, creativity, and competitiveness. And when you ask the Fortune 500 companies, and even small, everyday companies, your mom and pop spots, they're looking at diversity as their kind of primary focus. And so as educators involved with that process, we need to prepare our young people to be able to adapt to those situations. Does that make sense? And then diversity is a national security issue because as we become a global community, we have people who are interacting with each other through technology and different means. We have to be prepared, not just the business aspect, but also security. You need to have people who speak different languages, who understand the cultures that folks are coming from, to help them adapt to our culture. All these things are really critical for the functioning of our society. And so if there's ever any debate within your organization or in your school or in your district about this diversity, I would ask you to use these points to say, this is why these things are important. And lastly, it talks about the benefit of students. It makes them more creative thinkers when you're able to deal with people. It's not just about whether you speak different languages or not. It's dealing with problems in different ways, communication styles. There's some people who are like me, are very expressive. And there's others that are more reserved. A lot of those things that we think are just personality-based are actually sometimes culturally-based. As an African-American person, I can't say this about all African-Americans, but in general, African-Americans can be a little bit more expressive in comparison to other communities. How do I deal with that? How do I adapt to an organization that maybe isn't that way, that's more reserved? Am I perceived in a certain way because I am more expressive? Is that seen as a negative? How do I adapt to that culture that I might be adjusting to? The last thing is this idea of neutrality, whether it be race, gender, this idea that we're going to treat everyone exactly the same way. It's just been proven over and over and over as not to be a very effective, and sometimes actually can be a very detrimental approach. And I understand the thinking behind it, because you want to treat everyone the same, right? You want to, love all God's children, fairness. But the truth of the matter is, I can't deal with you as a human if I don't deal with you as the full person that you are. That includes your gender, that includes your race, that includes where you come from. If you identify as a Texan or a Louisianian, is that a word, Louisianian? Okay, we'll go with it. But the point is, you have to really appreciate those different aspects. And I'm going to dip and dab, and thank you so much. Next thing. The other thing I'd like to make the case for as far as diversity is concerned is that the research is really clear. Teams that do well, that identify cultural competency as a valued quality in their hiring practices, in their how they facilitate their team, when the leadership values diversity and inclusion, those teams do significantly better. They're able to manage issues more effectively, they deal with problems more effectively, whether it be communication issues, you name it, they deal with those challenges more effectively. They're more creative, they're able to come up with better ideas. The problem is people say, well, we brought in this one Latino woman and she wasn't a good fit. The question I ask is, was the leadership in line with onboarding that person? Did they provide them the resources? Did they work with the team to help figure out how we're going to work together more effectively? Because how many times have you been on a team that's been that same team for 10 years? And you've done it the same way for 10 or plus years. And you bring someone new on the team, and they're like, I don't know why you guys do it this way. Well, we've always done it that way. So the expectation is that person is supposed to adjust to your ways. Never asking the question that maybe your ways are wrong or outdated. There's still some people in your schools, what's that little machine with the purple ink?
Give me a graph.
Yeah, now I know some of y'all may not have any other choice. It's just, we're always going to have that thing, but I sure do want that thing to be killed. Because it's a tool, it's a resource, but the question is, I'm not saying that particular resource is outdated, but asking the question should something like that kind of technology be given away? Should it be put out to pasture? And if someone doesn't adapt easily to that kind of resource, are they a bad person because they don't like using it? And so really the issue is having leadership, having resources that really allow you to deal with diversity and inclusion more effectively. Does this make sense? Cool. Again, good slide that gives you the case. One of the challenges is that, you start asking people this question about, where do people stand on racism? Well, the truth of the matter is, more than any time in our history as a country, people see racism and other issues as a priority. You don't run across too many people who are like, well, racism isn't a problem. Well, the numbers are really clear. I mean, yeah, we have some people who feel that way, but the majority of people understand that racism and other issues are big issues. And when you look at the numbers, you compare from 1995 to today, you see a significant jump in the number of people who see racism as a challenge. Part of that reason is because, you see it on the news, we have a black president, he brings it up every once in a while. I mean, these are things that are on people's radar, and so it's a good thing that people are at least aware of it. One of the things I do want you to be aware of is that there still is a difference between different racial groups on the perception of the importance of racism. So while probably likely that white Americans do see racism as a higher priority, in comparison to a lot of their African American and Hispanic peers, it still doesn't compare. And the reason I bring this up is not to say that white people don't care. They do care. They're very much aware of these issues. But when you compare it to some of you see that others might see this as a more critical issue. Am I making sense? All right, what I want to do here is show you a video. So, just to set up, who's seen the movie Trainwreck? All right, so a majority have not. So do not spoil it for the folks who have not seen this. Basically, this is the first scene between the two main characters who meet for the very first time, and it's kind of an awkward situation because they're very different personalities. And so I just want you to observe their interaction on this one scene, and hopefully we'll get this right.
I think sports brings people together, it kind of forms a community.
That's what I'm saying.
Right, yeah, obviously. I'll tell you another thing that's great about this job is that I get to work with athletes, which means that I work out with a lot of
black people?
Injuries. What did you say? Did you say black people?
No.
Do you have a problem with black people?
No, I love black people. I prefer black people.
Do you have black friends?
Endless black friends.
Can you show me pictures of your black friends on your phone?
You want to see pictures on my phone of my black friends?
I mean, you gotta have a lot of them.
I have so many. I'm just deciding which one because there's like so many. Oh, here we go.
Oh, great.
So
Let's see.
You're going to be eating your words.
Oh, good.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, get ready. Black friend.
That is you and a white friend, and that is a black waiter pouring your water.
Let me find another one. Oh, my phone died. I'm going to let you go back to doctor.
Cool. For those who haven't seen that scene before, what were your initial thoughts when you saw that situation? Just real quick, anyone. Did anyone feel like kind of awkward for her? 'Cause I was going to ask y'all to pull out your phones and tell me how many black friends you have, but I felt like I didn't want to put you in that bad position. The point of the matter is that what she's really articulating here in this scene is that for a lot of just people in general, but white Americans in general, there is that kind of awkwardness that we sometimes feel because who wants to be called a racist? Anything that reflects being closely resembling that because you don't have black friends or Latino friends or a gay friend, sometimes it looks poorly upon you. But the truth of the matter is it's not always easy to find those friends. You tend to gravitate towards folks who are like yourself. And so I think she's making light in this situation of those circumstances. But one of the things I wanted to highlight here was one of the truths around our social networks. And one of the things that came out, I believe it was 2014, they did some research. And what they found out is when they looked at white Americans, they noticed that of their social networks, of their friends, and when I say your friends, I'm not talking about Facebook friends. I have 1,900 Facebook friends. I promise you, I don't know most of them. When I say friends, these are people you go to get advice. These are folks who you confide in. These are people who know you. In some ways, maybe know you better than you know yourself, right? These are your real friends. When you look at white Americans, 91% of their friends are going to also be white. And when we look at the numbers, I know it's hard to see, but what you'll see there is that 1% of them are black, 1% of them are Latino, 1% of them are Asian. The only one that goes above 1% is the don't know, 3%. And when you look at the numbers, when you ask white Americans, what you find out is that a whole 75% of them have no non-white friends. So what I'm asking you to think about is, who are your friends? Who your remember T-Mobile had your Fab Five? Think about who your friends are. Now, this is not some assault on who your friends are. What I'm asking you to say is that oftentimes in our day-to-day activities, the people that we trust and we deal with, if they're only like ourselves, they keep us in our comfort zone, and that's nice, but who's going to challenge us? Who's going to ask us, maybe you should do that differently? And to be honest, for me, I can't go to my friends who are just like me to ask them advice about something I know they're going to give me the answer I'm going to receive. Oftentimes, I'm going to be challenged by people who are different than me, who are going to see things from a different perspective. And so what I encourage people to do is to go outside those 5 friends they have, who those people they trust, and find others who can also give them that insight and perspective. And if you're asking, you say, oh, I'm white. Well, how is it for blacks? For blacks, it's around 65%. 65% of African Americans only have have some, I'm sorry, let me say it differently. 65% of blacks usually have almost all people of color as their friends. So the numbers are different, but at the highest number are white Americans. They have nothing but non-white friends. Am I making sense? Okay. And so when you think about hiring practices, when you think about who you're going to bring on your team, this has a real strong impact on that. Other thing I wanted to highlight here, and it may be difficult for you to see here, it talks about because one of the things I hear from educators is that, when we look at our millennials, they've been exposed to so much, and the diversity that they're exposed to is so different than what we experience. They must be, more aware, more culturally competent. And when you look at the numbers, we find that actually that's not true. What we find out is that there are actually not many difference between Generation X and millennials, and not much difference between baby boomers and millennials. So that idea that we've done so much for our young people that they're just advancing so much quicker than we are when it comes to issues of diversity and inclusion, when they ask the question, rate blacks' laziness, hardworking compared to whites, they think about the same. When you ask blacks, do you believe blacks are less intelligent than whites? About the same. These are millennials. When you ask blacks less well off due to lack of motivation, basically saying we don't have motivation to be successful. About the same. And I know that intuitively because these conversations come up amongst our young people, where you have Latinos, African Americans, other groups of people saying, these are the things that are being said to me by my friends. These are the things that are being said to me in class. Not by teachers, by their peers. And so this assumption that somehow the millennials are more advanced than us actually just isn't true. And so I think the work that we have when it comes to diversity and inclusion is just as important today as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Does that make sense? For some people, this can be really disappointing because they feel like, hey, we've been doing this for so long, we should have made some kind of effort. I would say part of the challenge is we focus so much on color blindness and neutrality that we haven't really had the really hard conversations around race and diversity. And that's been the problem up to this point. Until we really have those harder conversations about diversity and inclusion with ourselves primarily, but also with our young people, there won't be much progress. And so the good news is this. One of the things that we know is that most people, almost all people value fairness. I mean, we live in a democracy, right? We all believe in the sense of one person, one vote. Most people believe in some version of diversity and inclusion, at least the idea of it. When you look at organizations, whether it be in education, business, most of them have focused on social good as something that kind of brings us together. The challenge is that we have a difficulty translating our values into action. I can value something. I mean, how many times have you come across someone who's like a good Christian, but they're doing non-Christian things? They haven't quite figured out how to translate those Christian values into behavior because it's easier said than done. It just is. Difficulty connecting with stakeholders because now a lot of our jobs, whether you're in IT or a teacher or whatever you do, they expect you to go out into the community and connect with stakeholders. You want me to leave the office and talk to who? That parent who she does is cuss people out from day to day? I mean, that's a very intimidating situation to be in. So you have to figure out how do I cross that bridge? It's not always evident. Leadership may not always represent the diversity. We still have challenges across our leadership. We have the same kinds of folks in leadership. I'm not to name no names, but you know what I'm talking about. And so the question is, how do you bring folks up? And so it's not just the token one Latino, one token African American, one token person with a visible disability. How do you bring more people up into leadership so they bring their insights and perspectives? And oftentimes what you say is that oftentimes the community, because we're a lot of doing this kind of work that we're doing, oftentimes there's a disconnect between the community and what's going on in the schools, what's going on in the district, what's going on in administration. And so how do we figure out, make that connection? And so one of the things I want to kind of focus on here is what is equity? We talk about equity all the time, but we don't really have a strong sense of what that is. And I want to tell the difference between equity and equality. They're both connected to fairness and justice, but there's oftentimes some confusion. Equality is what is applied. When you think about policies, when you think about things that you're doing, things are allocated and distributed. When you think about equity, it's about different models and programs that you're doing. Do you understand the difference between the two? Am I making sense? And equity is also about process. Equality is about outcome. And so illustration of that is this nice little illustration. I don't know, maybe some of you have seen this before, but it's this idea that you have, if you treat everyone the same, you have the same people have the same advantages over and over. Whereas when you have equity, the folks who already have a whole lot, you don't give them as much. The ones who don't have much, you give them a lot more. So you do have that equality. That makes sense for everyone? And I know this is a real popular illustration, but it's probably the best one I've seen. And so when we talk about culture, one of the things I want to bring your awareness to when we think about culture, how do we think about culture in kind of real simplistic ways? Well, we have culture, and it's kind of like this iceberg. And what do we know about icebergs? Icebergs, what? 2/3, some would say it's actually 10% of the iceberg is on the top. That's the part that you can see. 90% of it is underwater. So that being the case, we have kind of a surface structure and we have a deep structure when we look at culture. And when we look at culture, those are the things that we see. So when you think about a church, the building, the pictures, the music, these are all things that are really concrete. We can kind of agree upon the objective, and they're there together that make the objective culture. The things that are under the surface is the meaning behind it. So when I sing a song in church, it's not just the words I speak, but what's the meaning behind it that gives me? That's the part that oftentimes is hard to access until you're part of that church for a given period of time. I'm just using that as an example, but that's kind of the surface structure. The question I want to deal with now, and I ask you to take a minute or two to kind of deal with this one, is individuals were asked how they saw their leaders. They responded as follows. Leaders are viewed as a kind of parent, and leaders are viewed in terms of getting the job done. Real quickly, because our time is short, which one do you think is, and you have to pick one or the other. You can't say, well, both. That's the easy one. Show of hands, who thinks leaders are viewed as a kind of parent? And you think it's a leader as a kind of parent because, yep, you have kind of responsibility for them, and so you kind of nurture them and bring them up. Okay. Show of hands, leaders are viewed in terms of getting the job done. Show of hands. All right. I know some of y'all want to do both, but the rules are you got to pick one. And so, again, quick hands, folks who thought getting the job done right here. Why is that one you prefer?
I chose getting the job done because I felt like the leader sort of distributes the tasks and makes the decision distributive leadership in order to get the job done. That's why they're there, to be a leader.
Right. And you probably, for the folks who wanted to pick both because you don't want to be wrong, and that's okay. But chances are, what I would ask you to think about is how is your perception of these leaders culturally based? When we look at the numbers, we find that most Americans believe in getting the job done. But as Americans, we tend to think we're the highest, we're the best when it comes to getting the job done as far as that value. And what you can see is Australia, they got it way better than us. They really believe in getting the job done. I'm thinking you have to get the job done if you're in the middle of the desert. That's what I'm thinking. But when you look at other cultures, actually focusing on leader as parent is more of a focus. And I would say what was recommended over here is more of that value, that sense of responsibility for folks that I have a responsibility for. Both have positives and negatives. There's not necessarily a wrong one or a right one. My case here is to say that idea is not necessarily about what's right and wrong. It's culturally based. And so even our ideas of leadership can be really changed because of where we come from. Other thing I want to focus on with you, just again, bring some of your awareness, because you hear these terms, diversity, inclusion, kind of being thrown around. I like to simplify it so you're part of these conversations, it makes it easier on your part. When we think about diversity, it's about how do you get the mix, what are the mix of differences that are out there? When you think about inclusion, it's how do you get that mix to work together? And cultural competence is how do I achieve the goals that I'm trying to achieve? And so real quickly, when you think about a mix, it's all those different things we talked about earlier, those qualities, those characteristics that you have that you bring to the table. So it'd be ability, level of education, ethnicity, what tribe you come from. These are the diversity that we're talking about. Real simplified terms. I'll skip that one. When we talk about inclusion, it's about how do you get that mix to work together? It's getting those diverse resources together, that people, that time and energy. It's maximizing the contribution of every person on that team. And it's also enhancing the performance and motivation and creativity of the folks who are at the table. So it's not just getting people at the table, but actually figuring out how do you facilitate that process and getting to maximize the best that you can get out of those individuals. Does that make sense? And then when you think about cultural competence, and I want to spend a little bit talking about cultural competence here, the first concept I want you to kind of to gather is this idea that you're eliminating interpretations and behavior based on stereotypes. And I want to be real clear the difference between stereotypes and generalizations. Stereotypes tend to be based off of negative or positive ideas about a certain group, where generalizations tend to be similar kinds of ideas, but they're not judgmental. They tend to be, well, what I understand about African-American culture is X, Y, Z. What I understand about American culture is X, Y, Z. It's not necessarily negative or positive, it's just general understandings. And that's how our brains work. If we had to understand every little minute detail about a certain culture, we'd be overwhelmed. So generalizations actually help us kind of understand different groups of people with some ease. Whereas stereotypes oftentimes get in the way because of their negative or positive kind of connotations or judgments that are associated to that. Does that make sense? And so really using that information is the first concept. The second concept is increasing your interpretations and behavior based on cultural generalizations. So basically, as you learn more about certain groups, you're getting more details about that group and kind of digging deeper without judging them. And so when you think about cultural competence, what I want you to think about it as wine. Now, if you're like me, when it comes to wine, I only have 4 categories of wine. I have red, white, sweet, and bitter. That's my 4 categories of wine. Now, if you're a connoisseur of wine, you know the history of the wine, where it came from, why the wines in France are different than the wines in Italy. The wines are different than the ones in California versus the wines here in Texas. You know why you call it a white wine versus a red wine. You know all these details, right? Well, that's what cultural competence is like. I'm not a bad person inherently because I don't know much about wine, right? But we tend to put associations that, you're a bad person because you don't know a lot about people of color or because you don't know much about the gays. You don't know a whole lot, so something's wrong with you. What I'm trying to articulate here is that oftentimes it's about level of sophistication. How do I learn more so if I really want to learn more about wines, I can go find out that information. But am I inherently a bad person? No. And so I want you to think about cultural competence in the same terms. And so when we talk about, and I'm going to go over this relatively quickly with the time that we have left. When we talk about cultural competence, one of the things that I use in my work is an instrument. It's called the IDI, the Individual Development Inventory. It's 50 items. It's done online. It's been translated into 16 languages. So if you have folks who are Spanish-speaking or other languages, and when I say 16, it's literally 16 languages. Now, I'm not talking about Spanglish. I'm talking about languages that can easily be translated from English. And I use this instrument, whether it be on an individual basis or on groups. And what I'm trying to do is to assess on an individual basis, but also on teams, where they are in their cultural competence. Because when you're implementing a program, or when you're trying to implement a certain kind of teaching strategy, or when you're working with your staff to try to help them better understand, that's going to be contingent upon where you are in your cultural competence. My ability to really help you and focus and work with a child is going to be contingent upon where I am. And so oftentimes the focus is on where the child is, on who you're working, when the truth is the focus should be really on you and where you are, because that has a real strong impact on how you interpret information you share or don't share. It has a lot to do with that. And so I'm going to go over this really quickly with you. And as you can see, there's 5 different areas. And the first one is dealing with denial. And the great thing about denials is this is just the way it is. A person doesn't really see culture. When the whole thing came up with last night with the death of those 50 people, they saw that situation and said, it's just a loss of life, and it's just sad. The fact that a lot of the people who were at that club were gay, the fact that all these other details really are important, it's just a sad story, and all the other information is really not important. It's a good strategy because I'm not going to be really overwhelmed with a lot of information about cultural background. The good thing is that I'm still committed. I may not be aware of these things, but it doesn't mean I don't want to do the work. Does that make sense? Because the presumption is that if I'm in denial, I just don't want to do the work. No, you want to do the work, but your awareness, again, back to the analogy, your awareness of wine is just not that sophisticated. I just don't see certain things. When we talk about polarization, this is the phase where people tend to be kind of judgmental. It's kind of us against them. And what we're really trying to do is help people be less judgmental, to collect more information. So what happens at polarization is a person has a tendency to it's us against them. And so I'm having to defend my culture, where I come from. I may feel like I need to kind of defend who I am as an American, as a Texan. And so that's very reflective of this judgmental. The good thing about this is that there's a strong sense of pride. I know where I come from. I know who my people are. The challenge is that when you start dealing with other people, there's oftentimes an adversarial relationship. There might be a judgment about their value of being good or not good. And so this is what polarization is all about. Does that make sense? Okay. Minimization is actually the most popular mindset because this is where about 65% of people are. And this is when people they've done a better job of being less judgmental. They've collected a lot of good information. They connect with people really, really well. And one way they may do it is, I went to New York recently, and I saw a young man with a Texas A&M hat on. Now, I'm in the middle of New York City, And the one person I see there is from Texas A&M. I stop him and say, "Are you from Texas A&M?" He's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm up here visiting with my family." We had an hour conversation based off of me seeing his hat from Texas A&M. We started talking about all kinds of things. Now, are we going to be best buds in the whole world? No. I'll probably never see this guy again. But I was able to make a connection with him on something that we had in common. I went to Prairie View A&M, which is part of the A&M system. We just started talking about football. Next thing you know, we're making all these connections. That's what minimization is all about. It's making connections on those commonalities. The challenge is that I know nothing more than what I just told you about that young man. He went to Texas A&M. We both came from Texas. But I don't know anything else about this guy. And so what happens is that I do enough to know something about you, but I don't really dig deep in learning as much as I can about not just myself, but another person. So minimization is a great way of connecting with people, but it's also a reflection of the golden rule. Anyone remember the golden rule? I always get it wrong. Can someone help me out? Anyone? Do unto others as you would do unto them. The premise behind that rule is that I'm going to do unto you as I understand what should be done, right? What I think is a good thing. So on your birthday, I'm going to get you a red velvet cake because that's my favorite cake. Right? Do unto others as I would do unto them. My favorite is red velvet cake. You should also like it too. And if you don't like it, something's wrong with you. Acceptance is one stage further after minimization where you've really been able to kind of recognize culture. You've been able to really dig deep into that culture. The difference is here is the platinum rule. That instead of me do unto others as I will determine to do unto you, I do unto you as you want. And so, but for me to be able to do that, I have to inquire more. I have to know more about what you want out of life. And so when my ex-wife, who I get along with pretty well, I'm like, "I know what you want for your birthday." And she goes, "No, you don't." I said, "Yes, I do." And I'll tell her what she wants. She's like, "How do you know?" I said, "Well, I've known you for like 25 years. I'm going to know something." But that's how, when you have a close relationship with someone, that's how you're able to, because of that kind of conversation and kind of having input and asking good questions, you're able to have that deep knowledge about them. The challenge with acceptance is that oftentimes we have all this great information about people, students, communities, but we don't always know what to do with that information. Like, I know African American community is this way, and I know that the Latino community can be this way, but I don't know as far as what I'm going to do as far as policy is concerned. We're really uncertain about what decisions to make. The thing that's really popular right now is the whole thing about the bathrooms for transgender young people. A lot of people are again, this is not to be political. This is to say, okay, if a school is going to decide to do that, I have all this information, I've gone to the books, I've gone online, I can learn as much as I can about the transgender community as much as I can. I still don't know what to do. And that's the situation a lot of people are in right now. Whether you agree with it or not is not the issue. The issue is that now that I feel like I have to deal with it because my community is asking me to, I've learned all this information, but I don't know what to do with it. And that's what you oftentimes see with folks, a lot of administrators, is that they have all this great information, but again, they're not quite sure what to do with it. And lastly is adaptation. This is a person who has the ability to have that deep understanding of another culture and knows what to do with it. So I'll give you an example. I'm a relatively tall African-American guy. One of the things I have to be aware of is that when I'm dealing particularly with women is that sometimes I have to make myself small. I have to not take up a lot of space when I'm sitting down. For the women, you know what I'm talking about. You know, guys, they love to kind of have their legs kind of spread out and take all kinds of space. If you ever been who's been in New York and been on a subway or DC? Have you ever been on the subway and the guy next to you is just like taking up like 3 seats? That's kind of, I forget, there's a term for it, but men have a tendency to do that. Whereas the guy I have to be aware of, I have a daughter, I have people in my life who are women. I learned there's certain things I can do to help myself so I'm not taking up that space. But some women, they don't care, but a lot of women do care about that one little issue. There's a lot of other things that we guys do that we don't are aware of, but women very much are aware of. My job is to become aware of those things when I'm dealing with some of my, when I'm working in the work that I do. Am I making sense? The challenge is that oftentimes at this level is that I have a deep understanding of culture. I have a sense of how to change my perspective and change my behavior. But what's really easy to happen is that like any muscle, you have to work it out. Like any knife, you have to sharpen it. And if you don't keep it sharp, and it'll get dull. And so when I have someone who's at this level, I'm really working with them to expose them to different situations so they are keeping their muscles strong and their knives sharp. So it's really, and my point of that is that you can be in adaptation when you fill out the survey, and over a series of months, you might find yourself in acceptance or minimization because you're not working the work. I have one more video for you to watch. Now, this movie is called Dope. Who's seen this film, Dope? Good, not that many people seen it. This film is not a film I would show to your kids. I'm just putting that out there because you see kids on the film on the screen, but this is not a film for kids. This is a film for adults. But I'm going to show you a scene that's at the end of the film that I just want you to think about.
About 2 students. Student A is a straight A student who lives in the suburbs of Los Angeles. He plays in a punk band with his best friends. He loves his skateboard and riding his BMX bike. His favorite TV show is Game of Thrones, and his favorite band is the Thermals. He's a 90s hip-hop geek. Student B goes to an underfunded school where teachers who'd rather not be there.
I'm not going to take too much more time because our time is pretty limited. The point of that clip, and if you haven't seen the film, I would encourage you to do it. And if you need to close your eyes during certain important parts, please do that. When I watch films with my mother, she still does that to me. I'm like, Mom, I'm like 45 years old. Can you stop covering my eyes? But the point of the film is, in the scene, what he's doing, he's describing 2 different kinds of students. One who's into hip-hop music, one who listens to, is academically doing very well for himself. And then another student is his student who made $100,000 in a couple of days, was dealing drugs. And the question he asks, which student am I? And then he says, if I was white, would I have to ask that question? And his point is that he's actually both students. It's just he presents different kinds of students to different people, depending on the circumstances he's in. Would you see him differently if you knew that information about him? And oftentimes our biases about drug dealing and all kinds of things can have a real strong impact on how we see people. And what you learn about this person is that he's a very deep and complex individual with a lot of different influences in his life. The point is that oftentimes people of color, women, different groups, oftentimes are being asked questions that no one else is being asked. And so again, it is a rated R movie. I'm not saying you need to go see it, but it is a good film when it talks about this issue of that I'm trying to articulate here. But also what I want to kind of articulate here, and I'm sorry I'm holding this mic, I don't need it, is that depending on where you are in your cultural competence will have a strong impact on how you see that student. Because maybe you're in denial, maybe you don't want to look at culture, you're going to see that student say, well, he's a drug dealer, so I'm not going to deal with him. Whereas someone else is going to start asking some really tough questions about this person, say, and what if I was dealing with a student, say, where's your priority? I know you've been dealing drugs, but if you want to stop getting in trouble, if you want to have to stop looking behind your back, you're going to have to make a choice about where your next step is going to be. But I'm not going to overtly judge this person because of that. Am I making sense? Because I know you're dealing with students who are coming to you with all kinds of struggles. Whether it be poverty, whether it be issues with their families, not having infrastructure in place. There's all kinds of things that your students are dealing with. The challenge is, how do we, as a team, how as individuals, as a district, how do we support our communities and our families in an effective way so we're giving them what they need so they make the kind of choices that actually help them be a contribution to society versus a detriment. So I've taken a lot of your time, but we have 1 minute left. Any burning questions, anything that might be helpful for you today?
I've worked in different situations. One was a very, very small school district. So small that they graduated 35 to 40 kids a year. Mm-hmm. Okay, for those kids, culture truly didn't matter to them because it took everybody to go out for football, or you didn't have a team. Mm-hmm. It took everybody to be in this class or you wouldn't have one. Mm-hmm. They had been in each other's homes since they were born. Mm-hmm. But what created that was that there was such a small number, they needed each other for everything. Mm-hmm. And so this other stuff didn't matter to them, mm-hmm. truly. It honestly didn't, mm-hmm. because they needed each other. Mm-hmm. As I've been in larger school systems, the larger schools get, it seems to me, the more people tend to try to be in groups that might be like themselves because it's uncomfortable to be in a great big room and think you don't fit. So my question is, how do we help these kids in these large school systems that don't need each other? They don't know they need each other. Because these kids in that little bitty school system ended up with a much fuller, richer life, even though they were poor.
Right.
Because they had each other all the time. But I don't know how to translate that into these large school systems where the only time we put kids in small groups like that is sort of artificial. Do you see
Right.
what I mean?
I hear what you're saying. We'll push back a little bit. In those small communities, they definitely are, in sometimes circumstances forces us to deal with one another, even sometimes we don't want to, or our families are telling you, don't deal with so-and-so because he's from the other side of the town. And so circumstances will push us together. I do think that's true. However, how long are those people going to stay in that small town? Those same people are going to be moving to bigger cities, moving internationally to other places. We have a responsibility to them to prepare them for those situations. So even though you may not be dealing with it in that small town of 10 people, they will eventually. But as far as preparing folks real quickly for in those big, you almost have to, it's like a large organization, you almost have to do it, to fake it to make it artificially. You provide them opportunities where there may be something that they can bring, whether it be sports, whether it be cultural events, their interest in art, finding those seemingly artificial things that bring people together and have that commonality, like the example I gave you earlier. When I was in college, we had groups who were from Dallas versus folks who were in Houston. That is the most arbitrary thing to bring people together, but it's a way of bringing people together so they're doing things together. So it's a way of getting folks together, and depending on what their interests are. And this first thing is finding out what their interests may be.
Dr. Prince, I appreciate your conversation today, sir. I had a conversation with my team here at the table, and we talk about cultural competence, but we also have problems within our own culture. As an assistant principal of a large school district, people who come into my office who look at me and say, you look like me, but you're different from me. And so, or they perceive, and I even talked about my own family. I had a family member that was brutally murdered this weekend, and we went to the funeral. When we traveled from Texas to Tennessee, we were different.
Right.
Yeah. And so, how do we deal with that, with even in our own culture? Because there are some differences, and when we start talking about outside, but even inside our own cultures, how do we overcome that barrier as well, sir?
It's definitely a challenge or a barrier because the assumption is it's between the blacks and the whites and the blacks and Latinos and the black, or whatever where your starting point is. When oftentimes the biggest dig deep area is your own culture. Again, one of the things I said from the very beginning, start with yourself. And so if I just stay within my African American community, there's so many differences between Texans and Georgians. We call the same food different things. Right. They got this thing in Georgia called cha-cha. I still haven't figured out what it is. It's kind of like salsa, but it's not salsa. But they put it on their barbecue. I mean, if you just look at the difference between barbecue, you have some people who have rub, some people who like to dip their stuff in. I mean, those seemingly simple differences between communities can be something that puts a barrier between folks. Even on barbecue. How many times people get offended that you're not using a dry rub? I mean, it's kind of silly, but these are the kind of things that people get into beefs about because of simple things that they find differences among their own members. What I would say, the part of it is digging deeper and having a better appreciation of the diversity within your community, whether it be by race or gender, but having a deeper understanding of that, and then using that knowledge to better appreciate where people are coming from when it comes to those differences within a group. Am I making sense? So the work oftentimes starts with ourselves before we move on to others. I feel like we're moving on time. Do we want to take one more question, or do we want to end here? I feel like I'm in church. I don't know, y'all. You know, with the fans, with the white Jesus on the front and like that. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not so much a question as
a statement,
it is a comment. This is an interest of mine, and one of the research articles I read a couple of years ago, Okazawa Ray, and she talks about multiculturalism, and what she says is there are at least 12 realms of social identity that people can exist in at the same time. So ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, etc. The ones that people tend to identify the most with are the ones that they tend to be oppressed in. And so, for me, I identify very strongly as a black female in that order. Black first, because that's usually the one I'm most oppressed in, and then a female second. What I found to be helpful for my students, and I teach a lot of low-income minority students, I don't tell them the research behind it, but I present all 12 of those social identities, and I ask them, independent reflection, how do you identify? And they share that with me. If they want to share that with the class, they can, but that gives me the most insight into which places they feel that they're oppressed. How do they identify with themselves? That's the part that I like to draw out, and we spend the whole year talking about really emphasizing collaboration and understanding the differences among their classmates, understanding that differences is what makes you stronger. My pastor always told me, 2 people always agree, one of you isn't necessary. I don't want you to always agree. I want you to recognize that you all are different, you have different perspectives, and find a way to move towards a common purpose with that. And so in my classroom, my students typically don't get to choose their groups, but they understand, and we have that conversation, is that in the real world, you don't get to choose who you work with either. So you're probably not going to get to choose who you work with in my classroom. But if there's an issue, I act as a facilitator to help them work through those problems. And I think that's the most powerful role that we can take on as a teacher and an administrator, is getting them to see, yes, there are differences. Yes, it's important to recognize those differences. That's part of someone's identity. So you can't erase it because you don't want to see it. But how do you move around those to embrace that difference between them?
And I like what you say. The only thing I would add to that is that while it's really important to ask your students what they identify with, because what you may think is the most salient, most important identity they have may not be. I've dealt with many of African American, or someone who I perceive as being African American. I said, well, you know, isn't that like the most important thing to you? Like, nope. The most important thing to them is maybe they're from the Caribbean, or maybe it's gender, or maybe it's ability, or maybe their sexual orientation. So having that conversation with young people or your friends or whoever you're dealing with that better appreciate what are salient things for them will help you, so you're starting off in the right place versus making assumptions about what the identity is. And what they call this intersectionality, it's that intersection between the different identities that you have. Most people can only hold about 3 or 4 at any given period of time, but that's a brain issue that I won't get into right now. Anything else?
Definitely want to thank Dr. Prince. He was awesome, wasn't he? Fabulous.